Kia ora, hope you're all well.
Kia ora everybody, nice to speak with you, and I guess it's speaking with you again.
You've had a double dose of us this week, haven't you? But we're managing to be in the same room at this moment in
Yes.
time,
So
using
apologies
technology
for
in a
that.
different way. But just as we did earlier on in utility-based pedagogies, we just wanted to share some of the research that we've been doing, working with children and information communication technology in early childhood services. And I guess a little bit of background to the research, would you say, Simon? It started probably a wee while ago when Simon was teaching in a kindergarten, a private kindergarten in Hamilton. And it was a newly built kindergarten and was just opening. And one of the things that it talked about was that it was a ICT-rich environment. So this is a whole new building, whole new team of 3 teachers coming together, and we started to have conversations because you were obviously teaching there, and we started to actually talk about, well, what does ICT-rich mean? What is an ICT-rich environment?
Absolutely, and I think the first approach really sometimes is that ICT-rich for some people might mean a whole host of resources available, such as computers, iPads, digital camera, etc. That may, for some people, be perceived as being ICT rich. However, as we've embarked on this journey, that notion of ICT rich is far more than just equipment.
Absolutely, and what was really interesting when we first started these conversations with the teaching team, and they're happy to share this, they were part of the research. Simon was one of the teachers, and there were 2 other teachers there as well. And we started by just having conversations about how we saw ICT and how we thought it might fit within the programme. And we talked about our own skills and competencies, and it was really interesting, wasn't it, Simon?
Being not very ICT savvy myself, by my own admission, where I was working with colleagues who were a little bit more ICT savvy in the terms of using functionally quite a lot of ICT equipment for themselves in their personal life, and a real adeptness at using
the
those
skills
things.
really, the skills of the talk.
But there was still, by their own admission, no real thought about how we use this in teaching and how we use it with young children. And so in a way, it's not just about technological knowledge.
No.
It's more than that. It's a sort of pedagogy of ICT, as it is with the pedagogy of a whole host of things that we employ and approach within our teaching. It's the same thing is quite critical for the realm of ICT. I add and make don't necessarily make direct distinctions to other areas of early childhood education, but because ICT moves at such a pace, by all our own admission, it's important that we have a degree of pedagogy that informs our practice.
Absolutely, and it is one of the competencies of the Teachers' Council as well, that you don't just have those skills, those are really important. Some of those skills we're learning through our e-portfolios and our conversations and things that we do online during our programme, but it's that pedagogical knowledge behind what's happening and why it's happening, which is key to integrating ICT into early childhood services in meaningful and purposeful contexts. And it was really interesting to work over, we worked over a series of years working with teachers and the group of children and some of the things that we found out along the way. And I guess as we should say, if we're talking about ICT, we're meaning information communication technologies, which are diverse, and as Simon says, are moving at such a speed. Social media is one that we think of often, and social media is huge. We tend to think of Twitter and Facebook, but there's a whole lot of other things that we might use which are termed social media, which we might not consider to be social media. Blogging, Pinterest, Instagram, Snapchat, to name but a few. But again, it's that linking back to pedagogy. Why are we using it? What's it doing?
I'd hazard a guess, excuse me
for butting
interrupting as per usual,
I'm not sure,
is that the original research and a small research project we did in this centre, it was 2012, and I'm actually reflecting now, and phrases like Instagram, Snapchat weren't being used.
No.
And so that just shows you how fast things have moved on to now, that I would hazard a guess, without trying to second guess, but a lot of children might be using terms like Snapchat and Instagramming things and things like that, and a whole host of language that at that time, what was very prominent was the whole verb of Googling,
Google.
and YouTube was a particular popular phrase and use and site that children are very familiar with at the time of the research.
And I guess talking about resources and ICT in itself, that it's moved as well in not just the way it is, but how we use it. Going a little bit back, ICT was very much about drill and practice. It was a very behaviourist approach where you would click a button and move on to something else. But the program that you were using was defining what you were doing. So a very behaviourist approach. But we've actually moved on from that now to a constructivist approach.
Yeah, and the terms would have been like, I suppose, what was it? I've gone very far. Can we stop?
I'll Google it. No, we can't stop. We're in full flight.
Google it. Yeah, content consumption was that whole notion. We consumed a lot of content, and we, as Sarah says, that we were sort of reinforced for getting the right answer and everything like that. Whereas now we've shifted into this whole notion of content creation, and children now through things like iMovies and other things, programs are being drawn into being able to create new content, and I think that's quite a significant shift. We've moved away from that sort of.
Here it is.
Yeah.
I've decided what you're learning and how you're learning it, to actually us co-constructing together. Wikipedia is a good example of that, of where people work together to construct a website, and there's a lot of peer reviewing which goes on within that site as well. So we're actually making the knowledge ourselves. Children are making the knowledge, and that's a significant shift from I say that very drill and practice to now actually creating the knowledge ourselves and working together.
So now we've whittled away from the actual project we got involved in. So let's say that this was around 2012, which it was, and we've identified a few things that may have shifted. We haven't lost you yet at 7 minutes, hopefully. I think setting the scene, because we set a socio-cultural context really for all of this, which is really important and valuable. A lot of our curriculum is made of a socio-cultural basis, and so talking about some of the things that are happening around, and Sarah's already mentioned the shift into different uses of ICT, the different types of ICT that we've had there. What we've got today is already noted as some 50,000 applications, and those notions of apps have really moved on in this 2-year period as well. And the use of phone has become extremely more popular as well. I'd say that I would guess at the time, and probably currently, the iPad is also the weapon of choice for many early childhood centres as well, and we see literature starting to emerge now about the whole notion of iPad use because of its mobility and sort of portability and usability, which is a nice size for young children to use as well.
And it's that portability of being able to take the iPad outside. It's about working with children. It's about children working together on the iPads as well. So it's not an isolating experience. No. Sorry, Simon, what were you about to say?
Sorry, in that growth of apps, there's some 50,000 apps now in Apple's iStore that's been classified as educational and suited for use in schools. So it just gives us an idea that some 50,000 applications, and within our early childhood audience, or in consumer terms, market, then the early childhood age children are being targeted with a whole host of educationally defined applications and programs that have existed for many years, but now really have taken off with the growth of recognising that children within our early childhood age range are quite adept at using ICT.
Incredibly adept.
And marketeers, understandably from their perspective, are developing in that respect. So that's important for us as early childhood teachers to acknowledge as well. This is the socio-cultural practices that may be existing for many, many families within New Zealand. importantly, also the socio-cultural thing is that the cost and accessibility of these things has come down significantly, and therefore it is being accessed by a broader. It's not one for the higher or socioeconomic band of people. It's it's becoming available for a whole host of people within the economic world.
And also you can respond to the technologies that your communities have as well. I used to work in, I called it a digital kindergarten because when I was working there it was very much a digital kindergarten. It was before, I guess, Foundations for Discovery came in, so it was quite innovative in what it was doing. That was the head teacher, nothing to do with me at all. I was just lucky enough to be there. And this was in a low socio-economic area, but families had some cell phones, so we would use cell phones a lot. But equally so, when children came into the kindergarten, there's a whole host of ICTs available for them to use, because just as we have lots of books or a sandpit or things that we have in a kindergarten centre that we don't necessarily have at home, we can also still provide those things in our kindergartens as well.
Absolutely, and I think setting the scene again around this research project, which we will disclose to you in a moment.
We must get on to that.
But I think it's really important to set the scene, because that scene is still out there, and it's a scene that you will see coming in through your early childhood centre door by families and parents and whānau who are using some of this thing, and children who have some expectations around use. And that's one of the big, I suppose, difficult decisions that we as educators and maybe the ICT industry and other people ponder over. And it doesn't have to be yes or no. It can be a moderation and an expectation of sharing and balance, which is probably really important too. But the historical arguments around ICT have been it creates a whole host of inert people.
Don't look at us when we're saying that. No.
Although to look at
we are a bit inert.
But inert people that it starts to have repetitive strain injury on some people. It narrows people's imagination and creativity. All these arguments are there, and I would be the first to admit that a domination of using one tool or one focus would perhaps narrow somebody's creativity output at times and narrow their opportunities around. The one big fear has always been that ICT will replace those other things that happen in early childhood centres, such as through the other aspects of play, such as messy play, outdoor play,
socio-dramatic
play, all those other things.
But maybe this is where we'll come in. No, and that's an interesting thing. I've not experienced that, and I think if we look through a social cultural lens and perhaps introduce the children that we've worked with, they'll be able to sort of do a little bit of myth busting for us, because very much, if you imagine the children coming along, the families coming along, and they've got a little virtual backpack on their back, and in there is all their funds of knowledge, everything that they know, their expectations, who they are as a learner, the tools of their culture. We're talking about tools of cultures. This is a cultural tool for the most part for our children in New Zealand, and I'm talking about New Zealand. So in their backpacks they've got all these things which they would like to come in and share with us, and it's up to us whether or not we allow those children to open that backpack at our door and bring in those expectations, the expertise, or whether or not we say no, you keep that in your backpack. And this is, I guess, a good place to start talking about Jack, Amelia and Jessica.
Yeah, so we looked at 3 children, and the really interesting thing is what we want to share with you, and I think is very pertinent to your Making Senses paper, is this whole range of how these children employ and use ICT to reflect themselves as the learner they are. And there is no standard template of a child who's a particular learner, a specific learner. There's so many unique and diverse ways that they embark on their learning, and ICT is just one way that they would use that to display how they are as a learner. So we took Jack. Jack is a 4-year-old and involved a real questioner. And so he's a person who is inquisitive dispositionally, particularly, and has a broad range of interests shared by witnessed by his kindergarten teachers and also by his family. And then interviewing with the family at the time. Jack's curiosities extended to very strong current events. The Christchurch earthquake was one, and the Pike River mine was another. And he also wanted to just ask questions, not questions about what it was, but why. And that was big stuff for Jack. And it also, I suppose, we get an example of it from the learning story we share about Jack, which is that one day he was just sitting by the tree having his morning tea with all the other children and the teachers, and he saw this liquid coming out of the tree when we were sitting, and he wanted to know what it was. And it's quite interesting that a lot of the children then started to ask and not ask, actually put forward their answers, but their answers were focused on, and it's not a criticism, this focused on what it was called. And some people called it one child in particular called it the blood of the tree, and another child then mentioned the word sap. And somebody else said, "Oh yes, I've heard of that word sap." So there was a group of children discussing
all these working theories.
Yeah, and suddenly, but Jack said, "I don't want to know what it's called. I want to know what it is." And so he had to sort of really wanted to move away from what the other people were talking about, and he requested and initiated that whether we could examine this through the computer and whether we could look on Google.
And that's a practice, sorry to interrupt, Simon, and that's a practice very much endorsed by his family in his home environment as well, because when interviewing the family, they talked about how often Jack would have questions. He loved questions, his mum said, and he would spend time at the computer with his family, looking for, searching things up and going around Google, as they used to call it. They used to call it going Google. Yeah. He also understood that he had a wide repertoire of places to actually access information as well. Google was one of those. He had books and he liked to talk to people as well. So he had a large repertoire of places he could find his answers, and he would select the one that he felt best fitted the situation. Yeah. So in this case, in the kindergarten, thinking about SAP, he worked out that actually Googling it would be the best course of action for him to find the answer to his questions.
At that point.
That point. Yeah. And he was very adept at working across boundaries as well between home and kindergarten too. So his family said, well, if we can't work out what it is, if we can't find out, if we can't answer his questions, he's very aware that he will go into his kindergarten to carry on that inquiry.
Yeah. And I suppose that was reinforced by the fact that the kindergarten was opening up an opportunity for children to explore through the computer as well. They had embraced a strategy in the centre called Computer Detectives, where anything came up during the session that people were curious about or something they discovered or whatever, then some people might take on the role of being computer detectives to discover that and return during the session and share it as one of the Mat Times. The centre ran Mat Times. And therefore that was being modelled to them that sort of inquiry is valid and validated, but ICT could be used and to satisfy or meet some of that inquiry. So that was being modelled and maybe being picked up. I think evidence of that was that when children were coming in now with questions from home, that they wanted to discover it as a computer detective.
And they were fabulous questions, weren't they? I mean, they were absolutely fabulous. The question which triggered the whole computer detectives was a child coming in and saying, what actually happened to King Arthur? And I think you said, oh gosh, I don't know. Let's find out. Yeah. And and inquiries were as range as Andrea Botticelli. How did he lose his eyesight? Yeah. And children had particular theories on how that had happened, but they were able to carry on that inquiry as well.
Now, as teachers, ignoring the pedagogy in Jack's case, it would be quite easy if I had the lack of pedagogy towards ICT as well as inquiry learning, I would easily perhaps sit down and say, right, well, SAP is this. But as early childhood teachers, embarking on a curious journey with a child with their questions is much more invigorating than just telling them or giving them a piece of fact to be satisfied with. To go on the journey of discovery is much more exciting. And Jack came up with the particular question he wanted to write into Google. And this is the other interesting thing, and this is the other thing that maybe is about 21st century learners who are here, because we're in the 21st
We're there.
century.
We've been waiting for them to come along, but do you know what? They're here.
Is that suddenly a lot of information is available.
Huge amount.
And our role as an ICT pedagogy is also therefore to play a part about posing questions or sharing that information that's available through through ICT, and having conversations with children about about those things, what that information is saying, and are they happy with it? Are they interested in it? Are they concerned by it? Those are the types of inquiry that maybe all this information is now throwing up, as opposed to just spending time finding it.
So it's about supporting digital literacies in children, and that starts. We don't put an age on that. It's not when we go to primary school. No, it's far beyond. It happens before then, when we're actually starting to about critically analysing the information that we get. So suddenly you're building up that digital literacy understanding as well.
Now, I have to admit that a lot of our input and the research was around children who were 3 to 5 years old. But there is evidence of children younger who are exploring ICT and exploring visual and creativity elements through ICT as well. And there equally at the same time there is a body of people who feel that that is of some concern. One of the interesting statements that I read in an article from a mother was, "My 1-year-old child is using my iPhone. The most amazing thing about that is it's not amazing." That a lot of children are accessing and picking up all these equipment nuances and ways of using them by just watching others or having a play and having an explore.
Because it's part of our culture. It's a culturally mediated practice. So when we're talking about social cultural context, that's actually what's happening. So we're learning the tools of our culture.
Yeah, and like Sarah said, it's bringing those tools in. How welcoming are we of that aspect of a child's learning and learning environment? Are we prepared to have come into our centres?
So we have Jack, who's the inquirer, very much. Him, this is about Jack, who he is as a learner, and how perhaps ICT can support and enhance that, and actually the teacher's role in that as well, because sometimes we wonder where our role fits in that. So very much scaffolding and working with Jack, supporting digital literacy, and finally, going on a wonderful shared journey together.
Now Jessica, as another 4-year-old girl, who we tended to call her Jessica the Connector, and our conversations were around Jessica's connections. So she wanted to embark upon making a birdhouse for home, and she wanted to do it at her centre. And so I got involved in working with her around that. She was quite specific about what she had. She wanted to design it, and she was quite insistent that she was taking it home at the end of the day. And so as it came to taking it home, she took it home, and she just as her mum collected, she said to Mum, "I know exactly which tree this is going to go into, and where I want it." So Jessica is quite a switched on, knows what she wants type person.
And she's also a documenter as well, and this was interesting from the conversations we had with the family. She actually documented a lot of her work at home, so if she had created a chalk drawing on the floor which was going to be ephemeral, she would document it.
Yeah.
She collected things, so she took photos of the collection she has. So she's a documenter and connector.
Yeah. And as Mum described, I finished the story first
sorry.
anyway. So she goes home, takes the
Birdhouse
home, and then a few days later I'm sitting at the computer pretending to be intelligent, which I'm not, and she comes in and has this stick, her USB stick, and hands it to me and says, "They're on there." And I went, "Oh, what's on there?" And we entered into her sharing a whole series of photos she'd taken of the bird house being erected into the tree and it taking its place. And she was very keen to share that and wanted to so she documented it, like Sarah said. That was quite keen for her to document that. It was quite important for her. Now she wanted to share it with me and with other people in the centre, and therefore she was making connections with her settings where she things that interest her and are important to her she'd like to share. And I think that's a really important way of how children take up their sense of belonging and well-being, particularly if they are able to enter and cross these settings through, and in this case through ICT, it became very noticeable. And like Sarah says, she is a particular documenter. That's really important to her. Memories, as her mother calls, documenting of memories for Jessica are really important, as she describes it. And then just thinking about those socio-cultural practices that take place within Jessica's home. Jessica has grandparents who live in one set in the USA, one set in the UK, and on a daily, almost daily basis, the children, and there's Jessica's older sister, will have breakfast with Grandma in the UK through Skype.
Dinner. So Grandma will be eating dinner.
And they synchronise meals together on opposite sides of the globe. And that's a practice that they engage in on almost a daily basis. And therefore that indicates to us perhaps a whole host of impacts that has on children. The expectation of
being able to
do that.
It's a relational tool, you know, and it's and to be able to do that, and it's very much part of what I do. And she also has access to a camera at home as well. It's not something which is put away on a shelf, you know, for special occasions. It's just something which is there, just as we might have a pen or a pencil. You know, it's just there to be used.
Yeah, and it satisfies what in Jessica's case appears to be this reflection of her as a user, a learner, which is to document and record and create artifacts around her learning.
We wonder if we wonder what these children are going to do when they grow up. If whether or not whether might be a what do we think? We thought he could be a journalist. He might be being a journalist. Jessica might be an archivist. You know, but it'd be interesting to follow them, wouldn't it?
Yeah. And the other one, finally.
Oh, you'll be glad to know.
Come on, stay there.
Come on, we're only going to talk for 20 minutes, but
there's only another 4 hours to go.
Yeah.
No,
this is part one.
Amelia. And Amelia was really interested one day when we were doing some recycling at the centre, putting the in particular to Hamilton, this green bin outside for bottle collection, and we took all the rubbish out. And she just posed this question at this point about, well, what can you make out of recycled paper? And being, and again, this is where it draws us in the pedagogy, is being willing to say, oh, I don't know. I wonder what. I wonder what. And as teachers, we should be prepared to do that, especially and therefore not just deliver either lies or just go and find some facts and deliver it. We're entering into this whole world of co-construction and scaffolding, but co-construction can take place very well through the uses of ICT, and in this case it was let's go on and let's have a little think about that. And in this case it was the teacher suggesting maybe we could use Google or the computer to those, and Amelia was very up for that. But what was quite interesting, and I will stop so Sarah can say something because she's looking a little bit.
No.
Anyway, is that we went and found some information, we talked about the information, we pulled a few things out that she was really interested in doing, but what became really important for Amelia was to be